For most pieces of fiction, besides purple prose and someone writing just the worst fanfics, there isn't anything more unavoidable than conflict. In most stories, no matter how small, conflict is a driving factor. And sometimes, in fact, most of the time, we writers are too much of monkey brain pansies to let people just talk it out. Or we'll say something like, well, these two sides could never possibly work it out, or our audience is bloodthirsty, even though we know that's not the case. So, we usually end things with violence. But so many of us are just obscenely bad at it. So then, when you decide to ignore words and go straight to fists, how do you write in a way that isn't just terrible and contrived? This time, on Why Are You Talking About This? Nerd. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Waytad Nerd. I'm your host, William, and I will be your guide through the brawlic world of fight scenes today. A type of scene I have a lot of experience writing, but have never really been in real life without it just being embarrassing. I was in one fight, and it was just embarrassing for everyone involved. But before we go on, I just want to thank you so much for listening. It means the world to me to have my voice breaking its way into your brain in a long, prolonged, tight urban combat scene. Are you cringing yet by how on the nose this intro is? Good. Anyways, first of all, want to apologize for the late episode. I'm not entirely sure what's going on with my brain case. I've been trying to get acclimated to a new job that has a slightly different schedule. Well, not slightly, a very different schedule. And I thought I could work on this stuff at night, but no, my brain is too tired, and I was very focused on having mornings to myself, so I didn't really have any time to work on things, and just ended up slotting it in at random. But hopefully, as things start to even out, hopefully episodes will get back on track. I've also just been dealing with a little bit of block, maybe some burnout. I'm not sure. But I'm not planning on taking a break anytime soon. But just wanted to get that out there and communicate openly. Of I don't care any less. It's just things are a little bit difficult to sit down and write right now. But anyways, if you miss on Waytat, I apparently got outed by someone, and they know who, to Piper. If you guys remember, I gave her cafe, Piper's Cafe, a shout out a while ago, and yeah, I got outed. And to my surprise, rather than asking me to take that out of the episode or being horrified, she thought it was cool. So again, this week I want to shout out Piper's Cafe for being okay with that. Great coffee, and you should also check it out if you find yourself in Aloha, Oregon anytime soon. I will give you a warning though, so it is very good coffee. It will not be your kind of coffee if you like the Starbucks ultra sugar. It tastes like actual things that you can drink. It doesn't taste like just sugar. So just putting that out there. But if you are in Aloha, Oregon anytime soon, check her out. Also, be nice. be extremely kind, because if I find out that a bunch of dickheads listen to this show, I'll just end the show entirely. Like, I'll just burn it to the ground and walk away, and you'll never hear from me again. But anyways, on to the show. Alright, so this episode we're going to be talking about fight scenes, when conflict gets physical. And I assume you don't need a definition beyond that. You're smart. Mostly. I'm sure you can understand what the words fight and scene mean next to each other. So instead of talking definitions, we're going to talk about how fight scenes are usually handled as far as writing and tropes go. Firstly, most of the time, rather than dealing with a fuck ton of people fighting and your audience not being able to see all of it, or, when you don't really know how to demonstrate if someone's actually winning or losing in a fist fight, there's an easy way to, demonstrate all of that. Pendulum warfare and the advantage ball. Now, it's more important, so we're going to talk about the advantage ball first, but the advantage ball is a status given to a particular side of the conflict, usually one at a time, that denotes that they're being portrayed as winning to the audience. And to do this, most creators will show them being more effective and skilled, well organized, and luckier than their opponent with very few or no casualties. While the side without the ball is shown as a bunch of dumb, smelly idiots with no concept of tactics or self-preservation, and the worst luck in the world and crumbling morale. Which, hey, sure, it's overplayed, and now that I've told you, I know you will forever curse my name whenever you force your family to rewatch The Lord of the Rings again and drive them further and further away from you, because you're never going to unsee this. However, this does have some benefits. Notably, you don't have to actually understand strategy and tactics or put any real effort into demonstrating morale and confidence of your fighters. And that's hyperbolic. Really, it's just a quick way to show that someone is winning without wasting your words or wasting, moments with the camera to, show a bunch of different people reacting to a certain thing. It just is a shorthand for losing. And this leads directly into the other term, pendulum war, which is when large groups are exchanging the advantage ball back and forth. Because again, it's hard to show large groups winning or losing, so if you zoom into a particular part of the battlefield your characters are in, and show one side just absolutely waffle stomping the other into easily wash down the drain pace with very little to no resistance, you imply that everywhere that side is losing. And as a bonus, if it's your character's side, you can see them turning the tide in this particular instance as a symbolic representation of the whole battle, and after your character's part is done, you can just end the fight without having to drag it out any further. Which, while convenient, isn't very realistic of how wars are won, or how they're fought. There's almost never been a case in history when a war was won by a single person's actions. Nor has there, and there has been waffle stomps in history, a lot of them, but very rarely does the waffle stomping get passed back and forth. Usually it's one side just stomping all over the other one the entire time. So, it should be similar in your stories. But that actually reminds me of the term that we're going to be talking about a lot in this section. Hollywood tactics. Which is just a collective name for a whole bunch of tropes that are designed to look, sound, or read dramatic, but are incredibly unrealistic, and in some cases, straight up stupid. And hold on to your ass, this is 20 tropes stuffed into a trench coat at the bottom of the river. Starting with the one that you are probably familiar with from Game of Thrones. Charging light cavalry into enemy lines and keeping them there. Yes, it looks dramatic, but there's literally no reason for this. Because light cavalry are usually just dudes on horses with light arms like spears, swords, and horse bows, with very little armor, and they rely on the speed of the horse for their defense. So if you charge them head on into a line of dudes with pikes and the intention to fuck your face with them, what do you think is going to happen? In history, light cavalry are meant to flank and harass enemy formations or other cavalry. If you want line breakers, you want heavy cavalry. And you can kind of expand this in modern day a bit. Like, you wouldn't charge jeeps or APCs into a hardened defense point. That's for tanks and anti-infantry armor. Anyways, the second, and related, would be a complete lack of formations or tactics. Rather than actually having a plan, everyone just kind of randomly runs in the vague direction of the enemy until the plot demands that actually, they had a plan this whole time. I just didn't tell you because drama that magically makes them win. Rarely in media do actual tactical or strategic considerations come into play, and even when there's strategy meetings, they're usually pretty vague and useless since one of two things tend to happen. Some shit goes down and it's cancelled, or it goes through, but then the strategy basically immediately falls apart and gets abandoned. Again, Game of Thrones. I think like every end of season fight that happens, I did not watch Game of Thrones. I honestly, like, it's one of those things where it's like, this feels like something I would care about, but I didn't. But yeah, from what I understand, that's basically what happened every season, is they would plan this massive, massive fight, and then it would get to the actual fight, and it's like, well, shit, that didn't work, so I guess we're just gonna charge headlong. Anyways, the third is the use of flaming or burning ammunition and weapons, which is a good psychological tool, but was actually never used to the scale or as commonly as it's depicted in most fiction. Because, sure, fire is terrifying and hurts, but it's extremely hard to control as well as being hard to use and hard to, like, ensure actually stays on the weapon and keeps it lit. And it doesn't really increase, like, the force of your weapons. Again, it just makes it hurt more. So, it wasn't really used a whole lot. Kind of related to this is the full frontal assault being the first option. Yes, it's dramatic and looks cool, and scratches the itch that some of us have to just mash toy soldiers together and break them apart, but it's not really used often in real life. It's rare that you would toss soldiers in the meat grinder like that, while also relying on essentially blind luck and hoping that each one of them is individually a good enough fighter to win. But Hollywood especially loves it in sieges, which we've talked about before. And it's the same with fighting infantry battles in an open field at any time after World War I. Because it's a terrible idea, and by the First World War, everyone in the world knew better. Or, speaking of modern armies, fighting without any kind of aerial artillery or vehicle support. Because modern military tactics are heavily reliant on these things, because, hey, guess what? Guess what's pretty effective against enemy in place positions? Yep. 40mm high explosive shells. Or using the good old-fashioned shoot at more strategy to take down hardened targets. Which isn't how that works. And that's never been how it works. Like, for example, if in a sci-fi story your guys are shooting at totally not Dreadnought, don't sue us GW, and that their rifles aren't working, Hollywood tactics would demand that your soldiers kick it in maximum overdrive and pull out their backup rifle and start dual wielding. And then somehow that would work, because it, like, hits, like, an exposed, like, pipe or something that then makes the whole thing explode. When what you really should be doing is getting anti-vehicle weapons, like rocket launchers, or like, hey, that vehicle support that you told to fuck off. Or on the opposite end, using slow weapons like rocket launchers and sniper rifles instead of their normal guns would be better to use something a bit faster. Like when your enemy is using human wave tactics and it's just a dude with a rocket launcher. No one else is doing anything, just the guy with the rocket launcher. Also included in this would be no attempts at covering fire or flanking. 10th is in battles that have flight or submersibles at sea, not using all three dimensions during the fight. This is something that I see especially in like fantasy settings, where like there's flying creatures like dragons that both sides have access to, and there's no strategy or planning in the three dimensions. It's only like the infantry and cavalry. They're not talking about like what they're doing in the sky. 11th, despite otherwise being able to start shooting, soldiers being commanded to not shoot until the enemy gets in formation or until your troops can see the whites of their eyes, which was not and was never a thing in history, and it's especially rare now and probably into the future because of long-range sensors, airstrikes, and reliable long-range weaponry. It's also common in Hollywood tactics, especially in the self-flating USA propaganda like Battleship, for old technology, tactics, and styles against to fight and win against things far more powerful that made the thing that made them obsolete. Okay, by the way, what a shit fucking movie. The water-based aliens took out our electronics warfare capabilities, so we use old men in World War II battleships to win? Fuck you, movie. I'm not buying it. I know what you're trying to do. There's also all the things that waste your resources, like not using combined arms when it's a possibility. Combined arms, by the way, being a variety of weapons and platforms, like infantry, vehicles, and air, and having them equipped with a variety of weaponry. Misusing or not using stealth technology. Cover being entirely unused or being considered dangerous because for some reason all of it fucking explodes when it gets hit by, like paintball guns. Using your maneuvers and training at the last possible second when they're no longer all that useful. And also all those super soldier programs make your soldiers in some way unstable, dead, injured, traumatized, or otherwise just fucked up beyond all recognition. I love you, 40K, but yeah, Space Marine induction is fucking stupid, and we all know it. Although, to be fair, I think they do too, and that's why they did it. 40K is a satire. Speaking of wasting lives, you should also not be putting your leadership on the front line. Ever. I don't care if they're main characters. Leaders shouldn't be in a vulnerable position in basically any setting where some jackass that's dumber than a sophomore in high school can point a thing at them and revoke their existence. And that goes for both sci-fi and fantasy. In fantasy, leaders should never be on the front line because there's going to be an apprentice wizard that knows one spell, and that's Death Curse. And in sci-fi, they should never be on the front line because there's going to be someone who was raised in the slums that knows nothing except counting to 3 and how to fire a sniper rifle. Also, don't cook grenades. That gets used a lot for some reason, especially in video games, and I have no idea why. It's really stupid, and I mean, really anyone that's ever, like, handled an actual live grenade will tell you that's a bad idea. But the last one is the conservation of ninjutsu, which actually has its own trope talk on OSP and was originally going to be its own episode, but Red covered the entire thing, and also I don't want to, like, just copy OSP. They are a very good channel, but also I don't want to be a dick and just steal all their ideas. But basically, this trope is twofold. First, when your enemy refuses to use their superior numbers against you for essentially no reason, and the other form this takes is that the more of an enemy there are, the easier they are to beat. Basically, with the idea being that in all fights, the two sides must be evenly matched. Meaning, if your character is fighting a lot of people, then they're probably weak and easy to take out. But they're fighting multiple single combatants, then they're more of a struggle. And it's called conservation ninjutsu because it comes from, like, old kung fu movies where there'd be, like, the one main character that knows kung fu and then 37 ninjas fighting them, and they would win despite the superior numbers because either the ninjas would just wait patiently for their turn to get their ass kicked, or would all attack at once but be knocked out by a single punch when earlier scene they were kicking their ass. So, but I could keep going and get more and more into fighting, combat, and war tropes seen in movies, TV, video games, and books, but I think you get the idea. They're very rarely accurate. But that makes sense, because most creators are trying to entertain, not create some one-to-one story about the horrors of war and combat. And even when they are, They play down the least horrific parts of it. Fight scenes are unrealistic pretty often because creators don't have the time to do the research, and even if they're already familiar, they have a story to tell with a certain amount of time to tell it, and with a particular theme in mind. But now that we've covered those and had the slightest amount of grace, that these are for drama and narrative or plot shorthand, we're going to talk about how people think of these tropes. So this week, because we have another weird episode, we're rolling the current and why it matters together. So currently, while fight scenes haven't really changed, the audience has started to. Compared to other parts of stories, fight scenes are still pretty well liked by most audiences. Because most people, when a fight scene comes up, kind of just turns their brain off and watches. But the people who don't turn their brains off, are getting tired of how fight scenes usually play out. In particular, people who like to have more realistic fights. Or people who are just tired of seeing the advantage ball get passed back and forth. And this has caused a massive surge in the numbers of people who examine tactics and weapons on platforms like YouTube, because the people feeling like this don't want to feel crazy. But something else that these people have noticed is that it seems like a lot of writers' rooms also turn their brains off when they write fight scenes. And it either becomes this formulaic fight sequence you can see coming from a mile away if you apply just the basis level of critical thinking, or begins to say some things that the creators didn't intend. Like, for example, if you wrote a fight scene just because you want to have a fight scene here and didn't really pay much attention to who was involved, and accidentally had your vaguely Slav-coded bear man go up against your eagle banner-toting well-armored soldier boy named Hans and your big-titted samurai Garu that's totally not a projection of the kind of woman you're into, then, you accidentally just create an allegory for World War II. And now, you need to be extremely careful with how you do this. But since you're going brain empty Oonga Moonga smash the action figures together, and some portion of your audience is doing the same, the people that aren't are going to say something about it. And if you just so happen to have your bear man lose, and it's in any way portrayed as a good thing, well, I mean, most people will just understand that you weren't really paying attention, will assume you didn't think it through, but there are the crazies out there who will assume you want the fucking Nazis to win. Okay, so it matters because I don't want anyone to think I'm an asshole, right? No. Wrong. That's not the only reason. Making good and compelling fight scenes that are realistic, or at the very least, drawn from reality and are more grounded from your story, will make writing a good fight a lot easier. It will also make everyone in your story come across as much more of a threat. I mean, think, what's scarier and a better story? The Siege of Winterfell? I assume it's Winterfell. The Siege, I don't care enough to look it up. The Siege of Winterfell that we got, where the light cavalry was charged headlong into the enemy ranks without support, while artillery sat outside, almost entirely unused? Or a battle where the light cavalry was deployed in hidden flanks and in woodlands, and harried the White Walkers, while artillery rained on them before they eventually made it to the walls, only to be held off by more artillery, soldiers launching arrows down from the walls, and using long pikes to physically push them back, while cavalry harried the reinforcements and kept them at bay, and then it all goes to shit because the enemy's just that much better? Exactly. The second one. And that one can be a lot more dramatic, and you can milk that for more episodes. But it requires you to know your shit, and also want to make a good fight scene. Which the showrunners didn't, because they had just been sniped by Disney, and wanted to be done with Game of Thrones so they could write Star Wars movies. The bad ones. But you're invested in your story. Writing a good fight scene gets everyone a lot more invested because it's a continuation of the story and a demonstration of the risks. So it's worth it to do because it rewards people paying attention and gives everyone else something new, unique, and cool to ogle at. Alright, let's talk about how to write this. So, first things first, before we can get into the actual advice section, it's a good idea to talk about 4 common pitfalls a lot of fight scenes fall into, just to help you avoid them and figure out what works for you and your story. The first of which is summed up by TV tropes as talking is a free action. And this is really anything that delays a fight while it's happening, like characters talking, expositing about super special ultra attacks, gathering energy, childhood flashbacks as a character dies, and other forms of just standing around the middle of what's supposed to be an intense battle. Your audience just wants to watch the fight, and this is weird and unrealistic. And anime is a big perpetrator of this. They fucking hate to just give you a fight scene without spending at least half of an episode's worth of fighting just standing around waxing poetic about what would otherwise be a subtle storytelling element. And Dragon Ball Z is especially notorious for this, where there's entire episodes during quote-unquote intense fights where 2 characters stand around making homoerotic faces at each other and no fighting happens. The second is related to this, but too much philosophy, psychology, and wittiness can really fuck up your fight scene. Having characters try to one-up each other in the middle of a fight, stroking their own dick about their, and by extension your, moral philosophy, and just generally doing and saying things to, quote, prove their point, can be very exhausting when overdone. It can really diffuse the tension of your fight in a bad way, breaking up the intensity to make everyone be all cerebral or get annoyed that their precious combat is being so rudely interrupted by this nerd horseshit. Let the fight breathe a bit and have its own moment. You can set up the moralizing and psychological manipulation before the fight and let your audience see what you mean rather than just hear what you mean. The third applies largely to armed combat, but can be found in unarmed combat as well, and mostly with visual mediums. Avoid flinning or hack and slash. In real-life combat is neither a highly and carefully choreographed turn-based JRPG MMO hentai FPS, nor is it all just hacking and slashing and hoping for the best. Flinning, aka highly choreographed stage fighting, and hack and slash are both done for simplicity and safety. By having very choreographed movements ahead of time, you can keep actors safe, and in video games, animation, and similar projects, copying directly from a dueling treatise is absolutely simpler and makes matching animations a bit easier and quicker. But it's not accurate. Also, slashes and cuts are easier to animate and safer in live or stage combats because a thrusting strike is hard to avoid, a lot faster, and also activates the human fight-or-flight instinct a lot harder, meaning you need good training and experience to not flinch. On top of that, most of the time a thrust is going to do a lot more damage. Maybe this is a turn-based JRPG MMO hentai FPS. Regardless, how do you address these? Well, for live action things, while you do everything you can for actor safety, make sure at the very least it looks like attacks are aimed at the opponent instead of their weapons, and that the reactions look genuine. So, for example, if in a fight scene one character is doing a very clearly telegraphed overhead swing, rather than catching the attack on their blade, have their opponent move in close to them, and the blade swings where they were. Or choreograph one actor starting their swing before the other commits to block on the same side. So it looks like the attacker was aiming for the body when that was never the case. And for thrusts, unfortunately the only answer is more body armor. But hey, if you're filming something in the Middle Ages, it sounds like a good reason to have actual steel breastplates. Those were real good at stopping thrusts. In animation, though, in the first case, try to have some more dynamism, or let characters drift away from perfection sometimes. They don't need a perfect stance or pose, or do everything textbook. And if it helps you, I found out in the research that animating a thrust is a lot like animating a punch, which makes sense, so you can start there and then modify it as needed. And finally, while random encounters might sound like a good idea, They only really work in RPGs. And even then, in my experience for pen and paper games, they actually don't work as well as scripted fights. Never do these in linear narratives, and instead make sure all your fight scenes follow as actual scenes, not just as a detour from the plot. They should continue the plot and be involved in the story, not just be a sudden break for some ultraviolence before you continue on with the actual storytelling. So now we get to the actual advice. First, and importantly, make sure you understand the differences and similarities between unarmed, armed, magical, and on-the-run fight scenes, because they have some nuances to them. In general, unarmed fights are more forgiving in fiction, but you can have a lot more hits traded. However, the stakes tend to be a little bit lower. Armed fighting has higher stakes, but also a lot more noticeable technique and strategy. Superpowered and magical fights give you extra freedom and spectacle, but tend to also be a lot more unpredictable as far as how the audience reacts to it. And moving fights are harder to animate or film, and require a lot of spatial awareness from both you and the audience, but are very dynamic with multiple built-in win conditions. And once you familiarize yourself with that, the next step is to make sure you understand the challenges you're going to face. Not just in the pure technical writing parts of it, but also the storytelling. Because you can't just turn your brain off. There needs to be good character development, conflict, and world building. If you have to, use the fight like jingling keys to keep investment. And finally, some actual advice that isn't marinating in your own thoughts. Firstly, plan your fight scenes to logically fit into your story. They aren't just set pieces, they're part of the narrative. Always ask the following: does it move my story forward? Does its inclusion align with my main character's motivations? Does the story naturally flow into and out of this fight? Next, include technical details. Not too many, but just enough to give your audience some hair to grab while they raw dog your story's pussy. When writing a script, you can have choreography so people understand what the fuck you're talking about. And in novel and short story writing, you want to have specific details to stand out against other fights, but you also need to recognize that you're not going to win anyone over with minutia. And third, write in a lot of different ways to figure out what exact emotions and choreography work best for the scene. But I also wanted to include the advice from specific writers. So I took the advice of Doug Lansborough to show you too. And he gets more into the specifics of your scene. So first, your fight scenes need to matter. Don't just turn it into mindless filler because that'll bloat your story and that's bad. Never artificially inflate anything unless that's the kink of everyone involved. So firstly, if you were to remove the scene and the story is unchanged, then just remove the scene. Readers are really good at picking out if a scene is just filler. So when planning, ask yourself the following: why is this fight happening? Who's involved in it, and what led them to this fight in the first place? What are the potential outcomes, and is it worth it? And how will the fallout of the fight impact my characters and story? Be objective about these answers, and if you even need these. Especially with things outside sci-fi and fantasy, because they're a bit more forgiving. Second, allow the scenes to influence characters and characters to influence the scenes. Why are they involved? Did they choose to fight, or are there other options? Do they have a character arc, and what is it in relation to this fight? Your characters are just as important as your plot, so you need to make sure they're involved in your decision-making process for the fight scenes. The flow of the scene and its consequences need to match how your character both feels about it and how it goes. It can also reveal very important information about your characters, and so let it. And make sure no one leaves the fight unaffected in some way. Fights, even minor ones, in real life have consequences, and so the fight scenes will feel more impactful to your readers. Third, focus on the pacing. Break apart the elements and factors that'll determine what the pace is. What's your genre? Who's your audience? What's your writing style? And what's the speed the scene should be playing at? Study fight scenes as portrayed in your genre. How do your favorite creators pace and write their scenes? Some genres have very common patterns and necessary tropes to make them work. Does your audience even like fight scenes? Or will they gloss over them? Do they want a beer and pretzels kind of experience where they can sit down and enjoy low stakes action, or a deeply psychologically depressing look at warfare and the costs of battle? Those will determine how deep to go and how many to have. Then really examine your own writing style. While yes, your writing is a weird amalgamation of your influences, it's still yours. So just make sure that you're not copy-pasting. Mix up the speed and timeline of your fights as well. Make some extremely slow and others extremely fast. Switching between explosive firefights and slow methodical sniper duels over the course of days. This will make the story more dynamic. It also makes sure all your characters fight differently. Like intelligent and calculating characters will go about things more strategically, while your hotheads will rush in Leroy Jenkins style. And then finally, remember to use all of your senses during the scene. This is a greater immersion tool and also something that'll add a lot of intensity and helpful details to your fight. Since sight is pretty go-to, we're going to ignore that one. So for touch, make sure to describe what the characters are physically feeling. From their hearts racing to the scrape of pavement, from being tossed to the sting of a stab. Hearing, as a very important sense to humans, is just as exploitable. Ringing, thumping, scuffing, the gasps and screams that surround a fight, and even smell and taste for some of that gross out factor, or a real hard emotional gut punch like taking a life for the first time. Yeah, like a common trope that's actually not that bad is like a lot of the times when a character kills someone for the first time, if they use like a gun, like you'll hear like the ringing to get into their headspace. A lot of times it'll be first person. Like the camera will sway a bit. In writing, like book writing, you can include like the taste of like gunpowder and copper or something like that. But with that, let's go to the soapbox. Man, these simpler episodes are nice. Feels lazy, but it's nice in its own way. Anyways, for me being a sci-fi and fantasy writer, fight scenes are pretty bread and butter for me. And a lot of my stories contain them because that's what I've grown up on. From Ranger's Apprentice for my love of fiction books in junior high, to D&D campaigns and playing 40k, designing my own war games every 3 years or so, I've been exposed to fiction chock full of fight scenes. So much so that in my own writing, I often have a ton of them. But I try to make them interesting and unique. Because I'm one of those hyper-aware people whose brain doesn't turn off during a fight scene. I'm always looking for inspiration for my own scenes and writing. So I notice what's getting stale and try to reduce those as much as possible. So much so that I've even stopped throwing in random NPCs in the fight scenes meant to just absorb hits and die. I want my audience to see and understand the cost of what's happening, but I don't want them to go numb to, oh, Faceless Goon 14 died, and rather them remember that one time in a lunch hall before an otherwise meaningless character is killed. I'm never gonna really stop writing fight scenes. They're too easy and exciting. Sure, some settings I write will have less, but fights are a good way to turn the tension of a scene into explosive action, or to ratchet it up as the already haggard heroes have to fight once again just to survive. But, yeah. Let's get out of here. Well, that was a fun one. Sorry for another late episode. Again, I've been having some struggles adapting my schedule. But anyways, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast feed, like it, leave a review, whatever else it is you can do on your platform of choice. Send me an email at waytappods@gmail.com with questions, concerns, opinions, compliments, insults, actuallys, how you write fight scenes, what your favorites are, and how I ruined them, and anything else you want to tell me. Also follow me on Twitter at waytat_pods. And remember to check out my other podcast, Waytat, where I talk about topics that are usually a bit more pertinent to today's world, not tomorrow's world. Alright, have a good night, have fun, keep writing, and remember, a safe set is temporary. realism is forever. This has been Why Are You Talking About This Nerd? I've been your host, William. Good night.